you folks are going down to the fundamental founding goals of the WCRP Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse. I want to ask the three of you, do you have a view on what a safe landing pathway would look like in your experience working with scenarios? And what do you as developers, users, and communicators of scenarios think is most important to include in scenario development? And it doesn't matter to me which of you starts. If one of you has an idea, want to go ahead and start? Anyone?
Sure, I can jump in.
Great.
Well, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I think these need to integrate a number of things, and a couple broad areas I would just throw out there. I think when you hear safe landing pathway, you might naturally first think about climate change impacts, and how do we keep ourselves safe from those consequences. I would say, and that's good and important. I would say two other things that this would need to consider is the impacts of mitigation, emissions reduction activities themselves, because those also pose a lot of risks, especially if our safe landing pathway is one that's going to involve, really rapid transitions to a net zero world. Those are very, very big systemic changes. And in a world that doesn't really run super smoothly all the time, those are also unlikely to go smoothly. And so really paying attention in these pathways to what society is doing on the mitigation side. And finally, and this potentially makes the scope a little too large for this lighthouse activity, which is fair enough. But for a complete picture of what we mean by safe, for a lot of outcomes that are, particularly those that are measures of human well-being, so things like the poverty example I showed, for example, right? Most of the poverty outcome anticipated in the coming decades is not due to climate change. It's due to many other non-climate related factors. Climate actually has a fairly small projected impact. It's 100 million in 2030. That sounds like a big number, but that's in the context of poverty falling by, several hundred million due to other non-climate factors. So if we really wanted to be judging safety of a whole pathway, we'd have to be accounting for kind of development related factors at the same time that we were looking at climate impacts and mitigation activities. So it's a tall order.
We got a big job to do. Anita and Kate, do you want to add anything to that?
Actually, I wasn't quite sure whether your question aims at the way how we deal with the scenarios, how we construct them, or with the processes that we try to analyze in the real world. The safe landing, how can I imagine that? It has two completely different answers to that. The way we try to construct scenarios, the climate futures that we look at, you have seen, is very, very broad, not very technical, very generic. And I think the safe, the term safe, creates an idea how to get to this climate future that is not necessarily linear, but it's in one direction. And if I look realistically at what I really see out there in social processes, it's always an up and down. So sometimes we have a really strong drive, in climate mitigation, and then the next day something happens and you see it's, all over again, the same old story. So I often, when we discuss about how we think about the climate futures and these drivers pushing the social world towards or away from this future, with my colleagues in the natural sciences, I feel this strong urge that, you know, a safe way also means really a stabilizing way, that society, social processes are once and for good channeled in a specific way. But what we see in the real world, it's, you know, it's always turmoil, always something new. Even in the very few years that we have been doing this exercise, I mean, we had changes in the US government, we had a pandemic, we had a war, and so, you know, that's my impression on how we talk about safe landing. It's also the way towards a specific scenario.
Right, yeah. So the question is how can this stuff be incorporated and included in scenarios, I think. Kate, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't know. Look, I think it's very difficult to do, and very, very challenging. I think I think events of the last few years and you know, some of the work that's being undertaken now just illustrates that it's such a big task, you know, it's such a big set of things that need to be done, that interact with so many other aspects of you know, of world society, economics, development, so forth. Sorry about the background noise. That it's quite a, you know, it's just really, you know, I think things are going to keep emerging that we haven't anticipated, which is, you know, I think what's interesting about about Anita's work, but also, you know, a really important part of the integrated models work as well, is just to be able to kind of be fairly nimble. I think broadly, like the political, including the sort of political feasibility and the like, for want of a better word, the kind of like the justice and equity implications is really probably critical as well. And that's, you know, it's complex. I know modeling adaptation, having adaptation included very explicitly in scenarios is you know, really challenging, and that would, you know, obviously doing that better would be pretty essential to making it safer. But again, you know, these are
this issue of being able to build nimbleness in is striking me as really important and really, really hard. So we do have a question from the audience, and it's quite a good one. So I'll read it to you. I assume the three of you can also see it, but just as the question is for Peter Raymond, and what is the real world understanding of climate scenarios and climatic tipping points, as there are not square waves or disruptions in the RCPs or SSP narratives that reflect this? So we've touched on tipping points question a bit, but do any of the three of you want to say anything about that? Kate, that's sort of that. It's back to that realistic, and how do you make people understand? Question.
Yeah, that's yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, I think this is actually, I had somebody in the financial sector asking me about this last week and saying, you know, aren't we? Actually, I think she was referring also to the specific scenarios that have been created for the financial sector by regulators. So the central bank, there's a sort of a international central bank group, for example, that are developing climate scenarios for the financial world. But so the question was, you know, is this all too smooth? You know, are we not really seeing tipping points? Are we just kind of coming out with some very sort of comforting, I guess, comforting and kind of, yeah, smooth kind of transition pathways, and not really anticipating, you know, some of the really really disruptive point. So I don't, yeah, I don't know. I think that the real world appetite is probably very strong, and the, you know, and the ability to kind of incorporate these is, you know, robustly and nimbly is the challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. Anita, Brian, do you want to add anything?
I think I would like to answer to the next question.
You want to tackle Peter Alexander's question? Go for it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. I mean, we have tried to build up this framework for the social plausibility assessment with the 10 drivers that we think are most important for deep decarbonization. And then, as you say, sometimes happens, it can be a disruptive shock. And then it's easy to assume, yeah, but afterwards, you know, we'll get over this, even if it's 2 or 3 years of pandemic. And we have seen this with the emissions, you know, the emission levels. We have gone back to normal level immediately. But there are, and each time we have such a disruptive event, like the war, Russia against Ukraine, then we try to check with all of the drivers what is going on as a response. How is this disruptive event changing the direction of these drivers? And for example, if you look at UN climate governance, the political situation in the world might actually change for a very long time and in a deep way if what happens now as a consequence of Ukraine is a severe weakening of the multilateral state of the world, then the prospects of really effective agreements is very low. And so this really changes the state of the social world for a long time. But on other examples, you are quite right that you know, there are ups and downs, and it takes a more you know, long-term perspective to really get a realistic understanding of where these drivers are going to. And I think we should try to incorporate such events in the scenarios and try to understand which one is really a game changer. And I'm always very, very careful with assuming that something is a complete game changer, because we have had this so often in the past. And then when we come back to that same event, you know, with a distance from 5 years or so, we see, yeah, you know, everything is back on track in the old way. So it's a really fascinating question, how to respond to that, in how to build the scenario and think about the drivers and to analyze them.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah, intimidating. Brian, did you want to add anything more before we move on from these 2 questions?
I do, because I think that it's worthwhile to design scenarios to investigate particular, whether it's tipping points as the previous question, or it could be war, pandemic, particular event. If you're interested in how such a thing might occur and how the world might respond to it. If you're interested more in how such events in general might affect longer term outcomes, well, I would say the approach in the SSPs is not to ignore these kinds of, I would call them extreme events, right? Sort of extreme social events. They're not ignored, right? After all, like SSP3 is a regional rivalry, a conflict scenario where it's assumed there are wars, there are conflicts going on. Now, that we did not translate that into saying, well, and in this scenario, this country will fight that country in this particular year, and this is how many people will die, and so on, right? So there aren't individual events specified, but there are types of events that are assumed to be occurring that are part of the explanation for why GDP is growing in a certain way, why fertility is not falling as fast, or mortality is higher, or other kinds of assumptions like this. There was a piece in Science, a news piece a while back that I think did this very well in talking about the pandemic, right? Because the question, you can say, oh, well, the SSPs don't have the pandemic in them. I guess we need to throw them all out because the world is already different than in any SSP. And again, right, yes, there is no pandemic, but there are assumed to be events that influence the world to take one path or another that differ very widely. SSP1 is extremely different from SSP3 or SSP4. Somehow in SSP1, the world in general kind of devotes itself to sustainable development, right? Everywhere. There's a massive change in social understanding and priorities, and somehow that happens. And in SSP3, things kind of fall apart into regional factions, and somehow that happens. It's possible that a pandemic and our response to it is part of that change, right? We may look back 30 years from now and say, we got to where we are today in this world, which happens to look like a lot like one of these SSPs. When that pandemic occurred, we started down this pathway. It led to other kinds of societal changes, which led to other things, and so on. So I would say that it's not the case that scenarios don't include these kinds of things. It is the case they don't include them explicitly, and it is valuable probably for some kinds of analysis to actually do that, to include them explicitly. So I would say great for doing that, but not because we don't consider them at all at the moment.
That was definitely clarifying for me. Yeah, thank you, Brian. We got another question that's specifically, if you're not tired of talking yet, directed to you. But I expect that Kate and Anita may also have insights into it. We've got a question asking about this degrowth scenario that you suggested might be needed. The question is, could you sketch out how this would roughly look from your perspective, as the literature on the degrowth topic is rather diverse beyond the basis of increasing resource efficiency and reducing excess demand?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it could be mainstreamed as much as the other SSPs have been? And
well,
yeah, as I said, I expect both Anita and Kate will also have things to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion in various areas about this. And yeah, it's true. I'm not really up on all of the full diversity of types of degrowth scenarios of what people are talking about. I think the milder version is a plateauing of growth in terms of economic growth in developed countries, or when countries reach a certain level of development. So it's not necessarily absolute decline in standards of living, and it's certainly not declining or slowing down developing country trends. But I think there are other versions of it which are stronger. And so I would guess if something were added to the SSP framework, it might be one of the former and maybe not one of the stronger versions. And whether it became mainstreamed, I think at this point for SSPs, a lot of it depends on simply the community and who jumps in to develop something, and then more importantly, who uses it. because it will be mainstreamed if lots of people want to use that scenario, and there's a real need for scientific analysis that would benefit from using a degrowth scenario, or some kind of limited or degrowth scenario. Then it will be mainstream, just de facto. And there's a lot of stuff in the SSPs like that right now, right? Like the spatial population projections, the income distribution projections, and so on. There's no official body that stamps them. These are SSP official projections. But if so many people use them, they just sort of become that way. And that's the way a lot of this works at the moment.
Okay, that's, yeah, interesting. Kate, Anita, do you want to add anything? I'd like to explore this question of nimbleness a little more, but go ahead first, Kate.
Can I just ask, Brian, what's your sense of what drives that that interest and that focus from the research community? Because that's an interesting sort of process that you've described there. Like what, why are some, sorry about the noise again. Yeah, have you observed any like factors that particularly drive it, or like drive sort of excitement in the research community about particular scenarios or pathways or SSPs?
For degrowth pathways in particular, or just in general?
I suppose I think more in general, because I think there seems to be like a sense of excitement around certain things. Sometimes like you referred to the RCP 8.5, and whether that's very useful anymore. And I remember seeing this emerging as a whole kind of, really it emerged as a whole thing on Twitter as far as I could tell, and then kind of filtered back to the research community. I don't know, I might be wrong, but it was very, very interesting. What was driving that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there can be a number of different things. There can be a sort of path dependency, in that some things get used for something initially, like the illustrative pathways that you showed. The ones that were done for the 6th assessment report that came out recently for the mitigation report has another set of illustrative pathways, most of them based on SSP2. So then a lot of mitigation studies get based on SSP2 because they want to compare to the illustrative pathways that were in the IPCC report. And then you get this, sort of feedback effect, is that you get a whole bunch of studies, mitigation studies, that use SSP2. In other cases like the 8.5, it was an issue became highlighted, which was really in the end a communications issue, I think. I mean, it's a substantive one now. The world has changed. I mean, if you make scenarios that had a base year of like 2010, and then more than a decade goes by, it's likely that outlooks will have changed. And so keeping up and saying, well, at that time we hadn't had a really steep decline in renewable prices, and so a coal-heavy world seemed plausible. Now maybe it seems less plausible. That's natural to be expected. I think the RCP 8.5 thing initially got started with a communication problem, in that it became misinterpreted as the most likely outcome if nothing was done about climate change. And that was never the case from the beginning. But there was some wording choices around business as usual that weren't really good at the beginning. And, I think really through no fault of anyone's, but it became misinterpreted. And that had consequences, and it was worth pointing it out. So I think in the end, that was a net benefit to sort of hopefully correct the way the scenario is interpreted and described. And I think there will be some larger assessment of high scenarios in general, the sort of how high is too high question, which really there hasn't been a study that's really focused on that yet.
Yeah, that's good to know. You see that shift in the attitude towards the 8.5 happening.
Mm-hmm.
It still feels like a lot of people are just assuming that that's where we're heading. And, you know, a lot of research will only look at the impacts of that one and not the intermediate ones. But I'm glad to hear that shift, you're seeing that shift starting to happen. Anita, do you want to say anything about degrowth?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the specific degrowth idea. My observation is that it becomes more and more, not yet mainstream, but really groups and communities are trying to think about it and to describe what it might mean, that have been completely out of touch with such kind of topic only a few years ago. I mean, degrowth was a very, very specific idea in a marginalized.
It was a fringe
community,
sort of wacky thing, yeah.
And so now it's really interesting to see that grow, and my interpretation is that people start to realize that there is really this just huge gap between, you know, this curve of the emissions going down that we need to see at some point, and the real one, you know, that's just, it's completely disconnected. And the you know, the longer we wait, the more problematic it becomes. And I think it's one way of reacting to that, to find ways how could at some point could we imagine the emissions going down. It's not, if you asked me, it's not a very plausible scenario at the moment, but I like very much that it is discussed, because it opens up you know, creative thinking.
And creative thinking is what we need. So we're down to, we have just 5 minutes left. And with that, I would like to turn to a theme that has I've been continually hearing coming up, is the question of nimbleness and flexibility in the scenarios. And so I want to wrap up by asking all three of you, how could scenarios be developed to be more nimble, to better represent tipping points, for example, both and other kinds of rapid transitions, as well as extreme events, and both positive and negative? Do we just need to have a whole lot more people working on scenario development, or is there, you can just, how can we make them more nimble and less static, and at the same, and part of that also is people to understand that these are not fixed true things. The communication and misunderstanding problem. So maybe there isn't an answer, but what ideas you have? Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the way we deal with these changes is that we do the outcome and the plausibility assessment recurrently. We try to do it every year, and so we already assume, you know, that we will come to a new result. We hope not, of course, that for example, if we ask again and again, how plausible is it that we achieve deep decarbonization fast enough, that we were so wrong with our pessimistic assessment. Yeah? But it's we don't have the pressure to feed our drivers, our models, and our scenario thinking directly into a quantitative formalized model. So that frees us very conveniently from this necessity that you know, to create something stable that we can use for large-scale climate simulations. We have them as well, but it's a different exercise that we do with a social plausibility assessment, and we try to always bring it together, but it's not closely coupled into one, computer-based large-scale climate scenario. So that gives us a little bit more leeway to think about and to always include new changes.
So is it safe to say that the IPCC and CMIT cycles and the inflexibility in those cycles is actually really hobbling us in using scenarios effectively? Okay,
I mean,
you nodded.
have,
I saw that.
they are very strong. I wouldn't, play them out against each other. So I think we need a greater diversity of how we work with future scenarios. That was my point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that there's a role for the IPCC and CMIP cycles, and they're not things you would want to do, every year. But there's a lot of things that you kind of by definition make sort of not feasible to do it with these large scale, many people involved scenarios that you want to have be usable for many years into the future. That excludes, well, nimbleness in a way. Like you can't sort of look at really individual topics very easily, because then they become quite idiosyncratic and not widely applicable. So I think if we had a greater ecosystem, bigger and more diverse, of developing different kinds of scenarios and more places doing the kinds of work that Anita talked about, a lot more could get tackled.
All right, so we need to recruit more grad students.
That's right.
Yep. Kate, we're down at 30 after the hour, but did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
No, I think I just really agree with the last couple of comments by Brian and Anita, that we are starting to see a bit more of a kind of a proliferation of the scenario approach, and both the sort of non-quantitative, non-modeled approaches that Anita's doing, but also some like sort of smaller and nimbler ones. Like when I looked at transition minerals, I don't know, a year ago, there were very few scenarios looking specifically at them, that were looking at different supply and demand pathways. And there was a new one published just a month ago that was quite interesting, just looking at US transport. And, it'd be good to, I think this kind of along the lines of what Brian was just saying, it's good to see more, different approaches to mapping out scenarios. So yeah, so people will get more, end users and the public will also are becoming more familiar with what they mean and what they're showing and not showing, that they're actually kind of mapping out possible futures, not prescribing and not sort of preordaining an actual future.
Right. Excellent, super. And so on that note, I want to thank all three of you for excellent, really stimulating conversation. I've definitely learned a lot today, and I want to thank all of our participants and the people who asked questions. Kevin can correct me, but the plan is detailed notes have been taken of this, and all of this discussion is going to feed into the development of the Safe Landing Lighthouse, and as we go forward with this. And Kevin, did you want to say any closing words?
No, just thank you to everybody that participated, and keep an eye out for a future discussion series on safe landing climates. And also just a quick reminder that the Open Science Conference for the WCRP, that abstracts are due within a few weeks, and there is a poster cluster related to the topic that we just discussed today. So please look for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Good. I'm glad I called him in. And our hosts in Geneva are actually, it's very late at night for them. So with that, I will thank everyone one more time, applaud our panelists, and say good night to those of you in Europe, and have a good day to those of you in Australia and Eastern Asia.